Hey folks, Steve here with another Case Yellow 1940 video. Today this is going to be a bit of a different video. I mentioned this in the last video. We are not yet going to do the full review. I want to take another swing at one of the other scenarios of the game. And in this video we're going to be covering scenario 3, which is sort of the what if scenario, which allows the Allies a much greater ability to operate, and is sort of the like, well, what if the Allies had in the Sitzkrieg time period figured out a better strategy for a German attack, and how will that go? And then the Germans likewise can adjust to the adjustments that the Allies have made. So it's just a little bit of a, just how would things change? And there's a lot of important changes that factor into the game, but I've started to get things set up here. Setup is not complete. What I've done is I've put all the counters, or most of the counters, where they're supposed to go for scenario 1, but there are a number of different changes here that I'm going to point out, and we'll hit a couple different segments. One thing I'm going to just throw out there is that this video is going to be in a slightly different format than many of my others. I will not be doing a turn per video. This is going to be a single video, and I will only show cuts or the results of each turn, not each action chit, which is what I usually do. It ends up meaning each video is like an hour long, and it's all that stuff. This will hopefully be, it'll likely be over an hour, but it should be focused in on the broad strokes. I'm not going to zoom in and show each individual action. It is going to simply be the aftermath of each turn, with a little bit of commentary for each side as we go. And in fact, the intro part of this video may be the longest clip, because we're going to talk about what is different quickly in the scenario than scenario 1 or even scenario 2 that made it more worthwhile to play. So I covered some of this stuff in the previous video, but I will iterate in case you didn't watch that, and I don't want to make you have to watch a different, very long video to get this content. So this what if scenario changes up several things. One of the main things it's going to change up is the setup, which is why what you see on camera here is only a partial setup. So I've put everything on the map where it had an ID code. Just for context, so you understand what I mean. That upper right number, 1323, that would say this unit sets up in that hex. But here's the thing. The setup is more open, and I just got this set up the way it is so that I can think about, as the commander of the respective side, how do I want to change up my setup compared to normal? I at least have a baseline, which was the historical baseline. So what is different? Well, the Dutch, the Belgians, and the British, for the most part, have to set up in the hexes that the counters say. So really, the Netherlands is not different. The Belgians are not especially different. The British are not too different, but they do have a couple of units that used to get set up down here and here that have been allowed to set up within some range of Lille, and I have them set up along the coast here, reinforced by the BEF units, which are more open placement in every scenario. The French, which I have set up, again, the historical setup for the moment, besides, I think I've got, no, I do have them set up there. The French can set up anywhere within France. So what does that change? Well, I'm going to have to double check, but I think it does mean that they can't set up in Belgium. I'll double check that, and when we show that part of the video, you'll see that they can set up anywhere in France, which is awfully wide in terms of where they want to go. But what that will mean is that we're going to lose some forward positions here. So these guys that are all the way in Belgium, up here, or even across the river over here, they're going to be back further. What's interesting, in the playbook doesn't do a very good job of explaining this. The playbook for the scenario information for this scenario says to use the scenario 1 and 2 map, but on the other side of the game map is another map, and this is the scenario 3 map. It even says so up here, scenario 3, right? So what's different is that this printing of the map lacks all the weird dotted lines that were all over the map to denote the Maginot Zone and the dial plan line and all of that stuff. All that's removed, and the map looks much cleaner for it. The only borders that are on here are the country borders. So Belgium is here, and the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. So the map is much cleaner, but it is kind of putting that importance on the French must set up somewhere in France. So what will this mean? This will mean that we are not likely going to keep these stray cavalry off in the Ardennes. We will likely have pulled these guys back. I'm a little cautious because they at least had the defense of the rivers here, and if they don't have that defense, I'm not sure what's a better move there. I'll have to double check. That. If they can only set up in France, that in some parts of the line that may actually be worse. But that's only start, so I don't know. We'll worry about it later, right? But these units up here I can bring further south. The French and the British still can't stack together. So if we give the order to the British that they have this northern sector, great. And then the French can more consistently bunch up down here and have a much more planned defense. And the fact that I can set up how I want means if I want to vacate some of these Maginot Line hexes to start with, I can definitely do that. That might open up the Germans to wanting to try harder at attacking the Maginot Line, but I can borrow if I want. I can set up in these hexes any which way that I want. I can pick my river lines. It is my choice, and I've not done that yet. So that for me, in terms of setup, that will be the next step when I go off camera, is I will be arranging the rest of these French units in something more coherent that I can manage more effectively, I guess, is the way I'm thinking about it. For the Germans, they will then get to set up, and I think their restrictions, there are a few. So units with a 4-digit setup can set up in any hex within Germany. And then there's a couple of changes. There are some units that I have them down here that get added to the German force pool. So the Germans are even beefed up a little bit for this, and I can set them any which way I want. So where the historical setup here that I have is you have a lot of armor through here, right? We have a lot of armor. They were going to push through the Ardennes. Well, and then I have some up here. I could, if I wanted to, say, well, the Ardennes, our trickery isn't going to work, right? Because the French are going to set up, but because the Germans technically set up second, I can look along the line wherever and say, that looks like the weakest point, that looks like the place I want to focus on, I will do that. Now, I can still push through the Ardennes, but I can maybe do that to focus on a push and then a uppercut through Liege or something, or through Namur to get into the plains of Belgium. I could focus my armor here and have them push across. I am not required to do a sickle cut. It is up to me for France and Germany to pick how I want to go, with the Germans having the advantage of setting up in reaction to the French. Those are big things. There's a few other smaller changes and details. The French get slightly changed up armor forces. The better defense markers, which the French will eventually get, or the Allies will eventually get, will be even better than the base scenario one, where they will provide a left shift for the defender, but they'll also increase the tactical rating by 1, which will make it harder for the Germans to infiltrate. So that will be helpful. In terms of the activation chits, the French, the Allies, have chits that are equivalent to the Germans, which means that when we draw an Allied chit, they will get to decide if they want to move or do combat, just like the Germans always do, no matter what scenario you're playing. There's still a restriction to how many moves and how many combats you can have in a turn, but this is going to afford the Allies much more flexibility to respond generally, so that, if it's their chit, they get to decide the most effective thing to do in that particular instance. They also get some bonuses to some rail movement, so their rail movement's a little bit better. Their ability to do armored attacks on a move chit is improved over scenario 1, where they're going to be able to do at least 3 armored units doing an attack on a move action every move action. So that is a pretty good buff in terms of the mechanics. So those are all going to be helpful. The Allies also have, you can see in the Netherlands, a greater number of crossing interdictions that have already occurred that will slow down the Germans a little bit in the Netherlands, which will be tricky. And then Eben Amal is not yet destroyed. So I have a couple of markers here. It is considered intact. We're going to roll for that as the Germans. If we fail, these 2 interdiction markers will be placed here and here, which will again make it much more difficult for the Germans to make progress. So that'll be one of the other early first things we do in the game. The Germans can use the same Fallschirmjäger units as they would have in the other scenario, the paratroopers, or we can use them as a combined division, which is kind of a weird balance thing. You have what is effectively fewer units, but this unit has greater capability of combat in itself. So you're either having 4 spread out units or 1 stronger unit doing a paradrop. The Germans will have to decide how they want to do that. And then, so all of this sounds pretty interesting, right? We've got total difference in terms of the tactical and operational capabilities of both sides to a degree where what the Allies will want to do is basically keep the Germans from gaining any sort of significant victory and tying them down into a brutal war of attrition like World War One. And I think in these game circumstances, it is feasible, right? The concept of what we see as the fall of France in World War II, the historical events, are were unlikely, right? Maybe you could see them as unlikely, but they panned out the way they panned out for a number of reasons. If certain actions were taken instead, I mean, Germany would not even have been in a good position to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. They'd have been too busy in a struggle for survival on the Western Front. So let's talk about the strategic changes quickly. The Allies are not going to declare Operation Dynamo at all. No Operation Dynamo, no Dunkirk whatsoever. They are stuck fighting on the continent to whatever bitter end may occur here. So where in scenario 1 or 2, that's a great source of victory points for the Allies. Here, it's not even something to think about. So we can more coherently plan on the British just defending this as a particular sector of defense, the French defending this. The sickle cut has less meaning other than to try to encircle the Allies. Given the greater capability of the Allies to choose combat or move, though, great big encirclements of the Allies is highly unlikely. The other important thing is there are no victory points, period, in this scenario. And in fact, the game is predicated on very specific states. So the Germans will win if they get 2 out of 3 of these cases. If they exit 10 or more supplied yellow movement allowance units from the south or west map edges by the end of turn 8. So they don't have until turn 10. They have until the end of turn 8 to do that. They need to get 10 units off map, breaking through and moving beyond the map's coverage area. That's one of the cases. The second is capture and hold all 3 Paris hexes by the end of turn 10. And then the third is reduce the number of on-map allied units able to trace supply during the victory determination segment to 15 or less. The allied player wins if they can prevent Germany from getting 2 of those 3 cases. So for the Germans, they're either looking to have a good breakthrough and take Paris, or they're going to take Paris and maybe just have mauled the Allied army into, grind them into dust. Or maybe, and I think this is less likely, they never take Paris, but they grind the army to dust and have a big breakthrough. I don't know. I mean, you're probably doing all the same sensical things to achieve any 3 of those. So it is really for the Germans down to their tactical execution. For the Allies, it really is going to be picking where and how are they going to defend to keep those cases from applying. The one thing I will call out is there is some unaddressed errata in this setup where for scenario 3, the improvement markers, the improved defense markers, it says here all markers are received during the end phase of turn blank, and we don't know what turn they're supposed to come in. In scenario 1, they come in at the end phase of turn 5. The rulebook does not specify because it leaves it to the playbook to tell you. In the design notes for the scenario, there is a reference up here to the Allies getting these markers earlier placement of the markers, which means, okay, maybe that means they come in on turn 4 instead of 5. But then the German play notes down in here mention that they come in on turn 5. So there is some errata with no clear intention. Is it that the Allies get it earlier than turn 5, in which case you have to guess, or do you just keep it to turn 5? I'm going to go ahead and just keep it to turn 5 because that seems to make the most sense, where at least there is a very clear turn that is mentioned somewhere in the playbook. So that is what we will do. Those markers will come in on turn 5. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Allies will get 15 instead of 12, which is the number they get of those markers in scenario 1. So all of that intro, 15, 16 minutes of intro aside, you guys now understand how we're racking this one, what's going to be different, and I can look at getting these situated. So what I will do here off camera is do the full setup for the French, or the finalizing their setup, and then I will set up the Germans, and then we'll come back and we'll kick off the turn, or turn 1. I will point out as a part of this that even if the French can't set up in here and they have to set up back here, the Germans are unlikely to get all the way over here, so that basically on the first Allied move action, if they want, they can probably move in here and get on this side of the river in Belgium. So it not a huge deal that if I really can't set up in here because of the setup rule, because this is Belgium and not France, it won't take much to move those French units into position. So it's kind of a wash there. I doubt that the Germans could get all the way into here in before the Allies would get to move at all, essentially. So, okay, guys, we'll be back in just a second. Okay, here we are after the setup. Now, for you guys, that was just a second. But a fun fact, the first clip that you saw of this video was recorded 2 weeks before this clip. So I went 2 weeks before I could come back and keep playing this game. So this is why this video is taking like a month to create, because I don't have much free time. Anyway, I've done the setup. There are a certain number of restrictions on where folks can go still. So the Dutch still kind of have to set up the way that they're set up. The Belgians actually still kind of have to set up the way that they set up. But it is the British and the French that have much more leeway. And what I've chosen to do is kind of have a balanced approach where I am defending out here. I do have forces that can move up, and that these guys will move forward to a point. I think they're not going to go to the dial plan line, but I do think they're going to move up a little bit to maybe this river line here, to hold a defense and watch out to get too far up here where this flat terrain is most exploitable. So there's still a couple of hinges where it's like, ooh, that could be dangerous, but less so than the standard game would give you. The British are still set up here in the north with just the thinking that, yeah, they're going to have to guard the coast, but what I want to try to do is just, well, I guess I'm not entirely sure. There's a level of like, am I going to be trying to race the Belgians back to save them? Probably. They're going to have to go farther because we're not going to put the Allies all the way up. all the way up to here, but I don't know. And then what I've done, I've also put a few extra French units in the rear in the case that if the British fail, and the Germans want to kind of come up over the coast, there's something to stop them. And if they need to, because they're relatively fast moving units, they're the motorized infantry and some of the armor. If they need to swing down and around to stop something, they're effectively a reserve, and I think that's really the key thing, that I'm trying to plan for. Where this begins to feel a little bit more like an East Front game. I might have mentioned this in the previous clip, where if you know you have a good setup, or you think you can set up appropriately, and you know the enemy is coming, and you're on the strategic defensive, do you have a static defense or an active defense? And the situation allows us, I think, that the British, or the British and the French can have a basic main line, and then behind that line we can be leveraging our DLC units, um, the DLM, these cavalry, these mechanized forces, the armor, to be reserve uh, action groups, right? That if the Germans penetrate a particular part of the line, there is something not far behind that should be able to at least put something in their way. This will become more important once we deploy our improved defense markers, which will raise their tactical ratings. The tactical ratings are still going to be a problem for the French, but so that's their setup. Now the Germans responding in kind. And this is sort of one of those weird things in the base game. The Germans end up with this huge line of units along this road path that they have to just sort of be on, and they filter through the Ardennes. And I'm thinking, as the Germans, well, I'm probably not going to focus so much on the Ardennes. It's just a different game situation. We're still going to want to push through there for sure. We're still going to want to pressure the Maginot Line where we can, I guess. But really, what I want to have is a strong force that can move through the plain here in Belgium and try to come through here as just sort of a direct breakout. And if we can break out and do sort of a maybe like smash through and go like this, and just sort of cut some guys off, a different kind of sickle cut than maybe what we would be useful for Dunkirk. It's more like a sword stab out west is maybe what we want to try to have happen. But given that the Allies kind of have this well-defined defensive line that they're going to be able to more easily manage, my thought is we just try to. Well, first we're going to have to take out the Dutch, so I have appropriate number of units up there for that. We are going to want to swing through, try to resolve the Belgians. The Belgians are going to probably be a little better off because they're going to get to keep Eben and Mail, or there's a decent likelihood that they will, and the paratroopers will fail to take the fort. In which case, we're going to need the extra power to punch through up here. Just knowing that, like, we don't get the Ardennes surprise, I don't want the Ardennes to become this huge component of the offensive strategy, because it's just another place to go, and the French are probably going to have an easier time, dealing with it down there. Um, I don't know. It's kind of hard. It's weird, right? The situation is different. So what kind of offensive are we preparing for? What kind of campaign are we preparing for? It's ultimately very different. So I think that's it for the full setup. Now you guys have kind of seen, just to maybe cover a couple of things that I should mention before I wrap it up here. So I do have armor down here, a couple divisions here. I've got a couple divisions here. I've got divisions here. I've got some up here. So I'll just throw this out there. Here's a potential weakness of my strategies, the Germans. I'm not concentrating as much armor in one place, right? What I have, because I don't expect there to be a simple, easy place, just to a weak point to make use of. I have them kind of spread out, but remember that these units have decent movement capability. That the main thing I want to be able to do is make some deep penetrations, and then I can regroup the armor back together closer to punch where I've created a weakness. So yes, in theory, you would be saying, well, maybe it's better to concentrate your armor all in one place and really have effective punching power. In the first couple turns of the game, it's going to be about penetrating into this space here, eliminating units, clearing the way, and then once we see the allies kind of move where they're going to move and assess the situation, we should be in a better position where, really the German armor is going to be somewhere between here and here, and that's and if we're in the plane, that's all within enough movement points that any armor unit can get together with their buddies and punch somewhere that is weak or where we think we can make some headway. So that's the thinking. We'll see if I really foul it up, right? Because the chits could throw that for a loop. I might not get the opportunity to concentrate my armor after the initial advances. So I don't know. That'll be the fun, interesting part of things. And so what I'll do is I'll stop here and I will play through turn one. And when I come back, you'll see the aftermath. And then I'll talk about how turn one went. And then I'll go off camera, do turn two, and so on and so forth. Okay, here we are after turn one of scenario three. And you can kind of see right away as the Germans, we managed to knock the Dutch out on turn one. Which is good. And my ability to do so is derived a lot from the first playthroughs of scenario one before, where, if you get a pretty good paratrooper drops, they land, they're well positioned, you can kind of figure out a way to consistently make the Dutch surrender on turn one. And I did do that here. Now, it's a little bit harder because I think in this scenario, a couple of these crossing interdictions are added, but at least on turn one, due to the way attack supply works, it's really a detriment to movement more than anything. And I still got where I needed to go. Some of it came to some lucky die rolling to take Rotterdam and things like that. And we used all of our air in getting everywhere we needed to be there. But we got the multiple towns to get a city's worth. We got a couple of the cities. And then at the end of the turn, we did the terror bombing, which in this scenario, we have 3 uses of terror bombing. So we're now down to 2 from 3. There's no victory points for the Allies for using them, so we'll certainly want to use them. And that managed to get us the needed number for the Netherlands to surrender. Now, I'll have to look to see what sense it makes to use the other terror bombing. Can I do that to get Belgium to surrender differently? I think that's going to matter here in a minute. I'll get to that. But yeah, so Netherlands really for not much in the way of losses. We got them knocked out, so that was good. Happy to see that. That'll be important. And then in the center up here, you can see I moved into Belgium proper, and pretty much any Belgian unit that started kind of close to the border has already been annihilated. That's just from the multiple moves, which I was able to get some armored units kind of moved around and get them surrounded and just eliminate them on attacks. And then the following chits, the way they came out, we were able to do mop-up duty. So I probably, if I wanted to, could have moved some of these units here further ahead, and I just did not do that. I thought, I don't know, that's the way it shook out, I guess. I maybe could have tried a little harder to get them further, but I wanted to make sure I eliminated what I could so that the path is clear for advancement and that we've got a clear way to make some progress. So pretty good there. You can see if I just, and maybe it'll be easier if I zoom in a little bit here. You can see there's a, sorry, my stand is sticking a little bit. You can see I have a pretty decent number of my motorized forces there, like from my setup. But you can see, just like from where a lot of these guys are at, like this guy can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and be near these guys pretty easily. So this initial push is working enough that we're going to be able to concentrate our armor how we wish over the next couple of turns. So that's all going pretty well. Down in the Ardennes, things could be a little bit better. So here is where we see the net effect of the action chits being different for the Allies. So we had some Germans kind of pushing out through here. And we actually had a case where I think it was this guy got pushed back with a retreat result after the French counterattacked. And so just that ability for the French to get aligned the way that they want to and punch back was effective. I mean, it would have been nicer to cause a step loss, but just forcing them back helps. Here, we were pushing out across the Meuse, and we ended up having the French just try to get up and around this guy. And through a couple of combats, there's a step loss here. That is due to armor attrition, not actual combat losses. So the French actually got an AL1 result against the stack because they had a combat power of 10 altogether. And then the Germans counterattacked so that the next French combat shit would not be as bad with 5 hexes attacking 1 hex, and they forced these guys back a little bit, which lessened what could be done against them here. So there's a little bit of a, trying to cross the Meuse, but not in sufficient force to make a difference. And I might have to pull these guys back and just hold our own line and extend this static position up along the Meuse, which is really probably not what the Germans really want to have happen. But if now my concerted effort is going to be here in the plains of Belgium and northern France, then maybe that's okay. I think that remains to be seen. So a lot of interesting things there in terms of how this is going to go out. And just to show the way that the chits came out, it was German move, Allied move, German combat. Then we had an ally chit and we chose combat. Then we chose move, German combat, French combat. The key thing being that now the allies can pick. So in the case of the first allied chit, moving was important so we could get into a better position. And then the second chit they drew, we wanted combat so we could counterattack and then move and another combat. So that flexibility and being able to pick what we want to do as the allies is pretty significant, because it now means, instead of it just being, hey, we're going to get out there and we don't know if there's any point in trying to advance because we're not going to get a good combat timing. Here we have at least a decent chance of saying, okay, there's more allied chits in the cup right now than German. We have a pretty good expectation that we can get a combat and then a move, or a move and then a combat, and so on and so forth. And right now, the allies are trying to figure out how can they stabilize this line here, because it's really going to be where everything's going to get worked out and decided. And at this point, the Belgians have retreated away from Antwerp and Brussels and are here. I'm probably going to want to actually retreat them behind the British line and have them just hold back here, because if the Germans can't get to them, they can't eliminate those units, and they can't get to Ostend, they might be able to keep the Germans from getting the Belgian surrender, such that if Belgium is still alive, I think it's on turn 3 is when this starts, the Allies will have initiative, not the Germans. And if the Allies can get initiative, which is, it's that first chit, you sort of set the tone for the turn with the first action, the Allies could actually make use of that and maybe do some really targeted attacks on German armor spearheads. So there is a lot of value in seeing if can we pull these guys back behind, keep the Belgians in the fight, provide a little oomph to the Allies' counterattack, and see what can be done there. Though I think going into turn 2, the Germans can concentrate their effort down here now that the Netherlands are just done, and the general direction of the offensive is all this sort of one particular direction. Next turn, the Allies will also get rail movement, which might not have a huge impact on the game to start with, but it will over time probably have an effect to some degree. So there you go, guys. I'm going to go play turn 2, and we'll come back and see where things are at. Okay, here we are at the end of turn 2, May 14th through 17th is what this turn covers, and you can see that we've certainly have made something happen here. Now there's a several elements at play here that might not be easy to tell just looking at it at the high level. I'll try to zoom in a little bit so we can focus. So over here, getting across the Meuse is much harder in this because we had a lot more units set up down there. And really, the armor units that had been dedicated to trying to make a breach are starting to get dinged a little bit. Now, um, we're going to be able to shuffle some units around a little bit going into turn 3 that will help us realign our armor, but it is a lot tougher going. And while you guys didn't see the impulse interaction here, there was a point where the French were pushing back over here. The Germans managed to push the French back out a little bit. So what was kind of turning into this little cauldron battle, which could have gone much worse for the Germans, they just managed to push the French back a bit and actually eliminated some units. The weight of our panzers, we concentrated around this area, and you can kind of see the net result of that. We have a push through here, through the Allied line, where we have some penetration, but the French reserves were able to come in and plug the hole. The Germans pushed again, and you can start to see this sort of, push through movement. Now, the French and the British, I guess, together, the last two chits of the turn were, I mean, you can see the chits. So it was German move, Allied move, German move, Allied move, combat, 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 combat. So this is almost, like a regular, I didn't know it was going to work out this way, but both sides got to do a movement phase and then both sides got to do a combat phase. But the net result of that, which is good for the Allies, is they actually eliminated, as the first German casualty in heavy terms of the war, is the Ninth Panzer. So it's not good to lose a Panzer division. This is one of the weaker ones. So he's out. He's eliminated. If this were any other scenario, the Allies would get victory points. But that unit was here, so they've sort of opened things up. They did not advance because it was an engagement result twice in a row, but it did eliminate the unit. So there's this slim possibility of the Allies maybe trying to make something happen here. So this flank, this spearhead of the Germans is kind of fragile, but they still have a strong capability to kind of push through. The Germans didn't roll as well for their air availability as they would have liked, and neither did the Allies for that matter. In fact, so in this scenario, both sides are rolling dice to determine how many air units, air markers they get. Well, I've rolled kind of low for both sides, so there's air hasn't had as much of an impact. Through here, what I had wanted to do was maybe bait the Allies into coming into Ghent and to be pommeled, but they didn't take the bait, or I didn't take the bait against myself, whatever. The Germans did push some British back, but they didn't cross the river here because we didn't want to lose supply. So there is a river Hexide. You might not be able to see it, but that could pose a problem. So what the Germans are hoping to do is to pull up some more of these units that are kind of chasing the front line and then just enable these panzers to now push hard against the British and maybe pin them against the coast and just cause some disruptions while trying to capitalize on a breakthrough here and maybe start heading toward Paris or wrapping up the line somehow. The British and the French do have some reinforcements that had come in, so these units that can start to kind of plug some holes. And then this unit was a reinforcement that railed up to here because we have rail movement on and we can move within 3 hexes of a German unit. So I could plant him here and start to project some Zocs so that we're not, a totally open field. So already I can say that this scenario, this game setup is just remarkably different from scenario. It just feels different. The actions of the sides feel totally different decision making. The fact that the Allies can pick move or combat when they get that chit, they're still restricted. They can get 2 moves and 2 combats, but the fact that that order is their choice is such a difference from scenario 1, where the Allies actually feel potent enough that they can arrange combats on their terms. They can arrange things the way they want them to be, where the Germans just, they have a lot less wiggle room to make these really big advances. They just can't afford to do that. What's interesting is, okay, we've had 1 German panzer division destroyed, which is good for the Allies. The French have lost several of their armored units, though, in all of this fighting. So they have lost uh, completely. Oh, I should say. I mean, I'll just put these guys all in my hand so I can show you because it visibly more able to appreciate the reality of the situation. So they lost the first DLC division, they lost the second DCR division, they lost the first DCR division, they lost the fourth DLM, they lost the first DLM, and then some of those motorized infantry. So this is the attrition that the Allies are facing, where they are fighting toe to toe. And really, these were mostly lost being attacked by the Germans, not counterattacking. But the Germans are making the Allies really pay for their positions and trying to hold the line. So I suspect there's just going to come a point where the French are going to shatter unless we do something else, right? Like that, just attritionally, the Germans are just performing better where they want to be, and so I don't know what can the Allies really do, right? The Allies could maybe try to pull back and straighten out a new line, right? They could try to do that. Maybe we have enough units to form a new reserve and we could pull these guys up. So I don't know. We're kind of in that state at the moment where we've got to give up ground somewhere. It may mean the fall of Belgium, but the nice thing is next turn, on turn 3, because the Belgians are technically still in it, the Allies will have initiative, which means we can have the Allies do a move and try to get the line, a new line set up. But they're going to potentially be giving up some of these river hex sides, which, I mean, they're not a panacea, but they are helpful in keeping the Germans from concentrating too much power and getting just easy die rolls, where at least we can force them down into lower die rolls, get them into places where they can maybe attrit a step or two or something along those lines. So you can definitely see, the effect of, if the Allies had better intelligence, if they coordinated better, well, yeah, then the fight's a really different fight. The Germans are still going to perform well, but it is under much more constrained terms than the massive sickle cut action. And even if these guys can break through, where are they going to go? Are they going to try to come out here? There might not even be enough, ability to do that. Speed is going to be a factor, and the fact that the Allies can coordinate that much better means you're not going to have these guys just sailing out toward Abbeville or Amiens like that. That just probably won't happen, or they're going to get cut out of supply, or they're going to get chopped up a little bit, some way or another. And the Allies still have more reinforcements to come. I guess technically the Germans do too, but we'll see how that goes. So, all right, let me get through turn 3 and we'll see what is going on then. Okay, here we are after turn 3 has been completed. You can kind of see the way things are going for the Allies. They're not great, right? I mean, it's still another world from a big, crazy sickle cut. But the French are starting to pull units off the Maginot line down here. You can see both down here and over here. Where the distance that units have to be from German units is much shorter in this scenario. So the French don't have to pull off very far to be able to entrain and use rail movement, but they do still only get to do one corps per move action. So there's a couple that are coming off the line, off the Maginot line, so that on the next turn we can move more of these guys over to basically come up over somewhere over here, because things are starting to get pretty gnarly. And in fact, the dead pile of the French just continues to grow. The Germans are indeed just grinding them away, sometimes with some good defender eliminated results, which are chipping away steps. Even DL1s are important. I mean, if you can get a DL1 result consistently, I mean, that's just one step that is going to be really hard to get back. Even when we get to the replacement turn on turn 5, I mean, everything on the board is just getting chipped away. And so far, the Germans have still only lost one whole Panzer division, and that's it. They've not lost anything else. But the armor attrition is starting to have a significant effect. The Panzers are starting to get worn down, and we have several Panzer divisions that have taken a step loss due to the armor attrition mechanic. So the oomph behind the Germans is starting to get worn down, and I think the German half of my brain here will have to think about that and be careful. I have fortunately set it up that the very strong German infantry are well positioned in hexes where even if the Allies wanted to counterattack in force, they just have trouble getting really good odds results because I can get 7, 8, 9 strength factors into a defending German hex held by infantry that they just can't push back out of. So it's very much a, in certain places of the line, trying to create cauldrons where I can get multiple hexes to attack, a single, excuse me, allied hex and tear them up. So you can kind of see, we're starting to push out down here a little bit, putting some strain on the French. We have an engagement result here, actually, that will continue into the next turn. So that'll be interesting. I haven't had that in a while. The Germans are kind of pushing out over here. So you can see we've pushed some French units back with retreat results. So opening things up, it's really enabling us to have these really strong attacks that will almost certainly have some DE results attached to them, where, again, we're just attriting away the French due to maneuver. So this isn't like huge strategic maneuvers or outflanking, maybe not even, barely at the operational level. It's just forcing the Allies off their positions enough that we can have really localized assaults, is how I'm kind of thinking of it. Very different from scenario one, obviously, but focused assaults where we are going to wear the French army so razor thin and worn out that maybe one of our victory conditions that we'll meet as the Germans is to grind the Allied army to dust and then get down into Paris. If we do those things, we might be in really good shape. Now, pushing through here, that's one thing. We are also starting to push up against the British. They had some of the reinforcements that had come down trying to help hold the line, but we're generally advancing a little bit at a time. And even up here, we are really close to almost a repeat of scenario one's thing, where we broke out through here and we surrounded these units. We're probably not going to do this great big encirclement of the whole army, but we're gonna crack into Ostend and basically cause Belgium to surrender. They've only got 2 units on the board left anyway. But just having this to have them be able to swing down and just get these, again, strong localized assaults where we're just going to eliminate units. We might not be able to cut them fully out of supply all the time, but we're at least going to have really strong die rolls consistently. Time's not a factor here, right? There is no Dunkirk. We don't need to worry about guys getting away. So as long as we're diligently eating away at the Allied manpower and not losing much or at all on the German side, then that is reasonable and good. We're still on a timer to reach certain victory thresholds by turn 8. I think one of them is exit all these units by the end of turn 8. I may just have to decide if I'm going to go for that or not, and keep everybody on map through the end of turn 10 to complete these other activities. That may be what we end up having to do. It's just hard to say. No one's really had any major supply issues because, again, it's all very localized, grindy, attritional, direct combat. No wide sweeping breakthroughs have occurred because the Allies have consistently been able to get HIT, and they use that for movement to get something back together. And the Panzers just are not brave enough to go too far because they could very easily find themselves surrounded. So that again, I mentioned it in the last clip of this video, the French, the Allies being able to choose their action just gives them so much more capability to respond that the Germans can't do what they would have done in a different scenario. So, okay, I'm going to go do turn 4, and we'll see what happens with that. Okay, here we are after turn 4, and this is kind of a critical turn in the game for a couple of different reasons. One is this has been a bit of a bloody turn. Just to show a little bit of that, sort of zoom in a little bit, adjust the camera. I guess ignore the control markers because they're not anything, but you can see a growing number of dead German units. Now, some of those have been due to some DL1, or I'm sorry, BL1 results, some on some concerted Allied counterattacks. We've actually lost another Panzer division. Now, this one, if I remember right, it was a reduced one, I think from, if I remember right, yeah, reduced due to attrition, and then in a combat, because I had used the armor for shifts, it had to take the first loss. So it's disappointing for the Germans to see now two Panzer divisions, and this one that we lost was actually one of the better ones, a 5.56. So this hurts quite a bit, and it was with that combat that I was kind of realizing like, uh-oh, if we're not careful, we've now gone through enough armor attrition chits that we've got a lot of weakened armor all over the map. And as well as they've been working for us in terms of just forcing the Allies off their line and eliminating units, we got to do something about that. So Panzer Refit, I've actually called. I'll talk about that more in a second. Just for comparison, you can see over my dead pile for the Allies, there's a fair amount, quite a bit. In fact, it was getting to the point where for armor attrition, I had to keep pulling chits because those units were all dead already. I mean, we've really shattered the French armor heavily, and what British stuff there is attriting down as well. So it's just a rough time for the Allies too. But you can see the Allies have made a concerted effort with their final chits, and just the way that the chits came out of the cup this turn, to get pulled back to something of a line. Now, there are gaps. Oops. There are gaps here, sort of down here, here, up here, though that's less important due to the swamp marsh. Marsh, I guess, not swamp. We'll keep things relatively okay, at least until the Allies can go again. But the objective here is to try to get a better line, one that is shorter, and if we can, we want to get behind the Somme River and have a much better defensive line. I don't know if we'll last that long, but what the Allies want to do is they want to pull these guys back, if they can, pull them all back down behind this line here. And if they get an opportunity to use the marsh, that'd be really great as well. So they want to pull back. They got to pull the hinge back, where they want to try to maintain control right here, because this is where the hinge is, right? And the Germans are probably looking at the hinge going, well, we'd like to smash through that, and that leads us right down to Paris anyway. So you can start to see the Allied maneuver to stay alive, right? There is no Dunkirk, so where else do you go behind the Somme, along the rivers, in the marshes, and hope for the best? And ideally, we want to be able to get down there in turn 5, because at the end of turn 5, the improved defense markers will show up. So if we can get those improved defense markers along here, we will be in a much better position, I think, to hold. And the Germans are going to lack a lot of their major firepower, or at least their mobility firepower, because they are going to be not having their armor, right? So the infantry can try to keep moving forward, but if the Allies can get the right chit order, the Germans aren't usually probably going to be able to pull off very many good attacks. So it'll be really important for the Allies to do that. They're not reeling quite as badly as they could be, I guess. And some of that, I think, is just coming down to me, and I'll say this right now: if the Germans lose this scenario, they don't succeed in their success criteria, it's going to be, I did not focus enough on creating a pincer maneuver like this were a World War II East Front game rather than a World War II West Front game, where maybe I should have just punched through, surged out, and encircled a few hexes at a time. I did do that over here, actually. I got kind of like one or two units, or two stacks, I should say. There was more than one unit in each hex, and that ripped them up pretty good. That was nice, and I sort of got in a nice, very localized encirclements. But it would have been nice, and I probably could have done it if I tried harder. I just didn't make it happen. I should have tried somehow to make like a medium-sized pocket and circle. Now, some of that's due to the chit pool. It's not as easy to do that with the allies being able to pick what they can do. And I just didn't focus enough on trying to create those situations. Had I done that, we might be in much better shape, or we might even have fewer British on the board, which would help kind of coming down through this way. So definitely maybe some tactical opportunities that I should have done better at seizing, and I did not do that. So now I decided to do Panzer Refit because this is the first turn that I can do it. And I definitely want to do it because this means that they will come back at the end of turn 6 and they will be available on turn 7. And at the end of turn 8 is when the opportunity to get a victory condition by getting units off the map is going to be checked. So this means that the earliest that the panzers will be back and fresh will be as earliest as they can be, and that gives us 2 full turns to make something happen in a major breakthrough. I was thinking like maybe we don't even worry about that condition and we focus on eliminating allied units and taking Paris, but there are still a pretty large number of allied units on the board. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to take out 25 before, or get them down to 15 or less through the rest of the game. I just don't know. So I'd like to have kind of some flexibility there. And it's just going to help get all of the armor back to full strength, where we were reaching a point where the Allies could chip away more at the panzers, and that just would have been a problem. So this next turn, the Allies are going to pull down this way, try to get into better defenses where they can, and then the Germans are going to likewise try to get set up, chase the Allies, try to get in a position where they can still eliminate units and create some Swiss cheese in the front line so that when the panzers do appear, they can exploit. One funny thing is I did remove a garrison unit, or not a garrison, not the fortified line garrison, but the unit that was sitting here over here with the artillery and these 2 corps. So now they can focus on trying to attack the Maginot Line itself. But in this scenario, I don't think there's much to do if you can break through the Maginot Line, because these guys will lose attack supply eventually, and there's really only so many places to go. Many of these won't count for any victory conditions. It'd really be more about just eliminating units, and so they could like be tracing supply through one hex through here. If they take it, really we'd want to be like wrapping up one side of the map, and at least that would eliminate French units, I guess, that would be around here. But I just don't see it being a operationally effective thing if we make the breakthrough. It's nice to do it, I guess, but I'm not sure that it's really needed. So yeah, so there you go, guys. I will come back with the aftermath of turn 5, which, as a reminder, is the turn that the improved defense markers will come in, and both sides will get to spend some replacement points, and that'll be important. So we'll see what happens. Okay, here we are at the end of turn 5, and you can see the Allies had a pretty good turn. They essentially succeeded in their goal of retreating across the Somme River. Mostly, there's a couple of British stragglers that just have low movement points that couldn't quite get there. If the Allies are lucky with initiative, which they have not been yet, it's possible that they would get to go first, depending on the variable action round chart. So you can see that it's possible, but the Germans would have to roll low for it to happen. It is possible that the Allies could go first, and if they can, then they will pull the rest of those guys over the river as close as they can. Though it doesn't hurt to have a couple of these guys out here as some level of speed bump so that the Germans can't focus on our defensive line. You can see I've put the better defense markers on top of the units. We get many more in this scenario. Well, I guess not many more. We get a few more than in scenario 1, so we have much better coverage. And in fact, you can see we have some better defense markers all the way at the coast to about the Meuse gap here between our Maginot Line and what I would consider to be the sort of defensive line for Paris. Now, those little gaps are kind of not great, but at least for right now, until the Panzers show up, I think This is a pretty solid line that the Germans may have some trouble with going into next turn. The air availability rules also matter a lot here. So the fewer the Germans get, and they've actually had some low rolls the last couple of times, the fewer air shifts they get, the less likely that they're going to make any major headway somewhere. Once the Panzers show up, that may change, but I think the Allies are feeling pretty good. I mean, as good as they can be at the moment. They may need to pull some more guys off the Maginot Line. They want to be careful of just, there'll be a point where even if the Germans break out all over the Maginot Line, there's not much that they can do. So I imagine, there's not many French units left on the Maginot Line, but they will probably vacate very soon just to have some additional defenders down here along through here. The replacements were spent. The French, the fact they get armor replacements and infantry, they are able to get a lot of units sort of prepped to come back. They'll all be single step, but it will be more bodies to throw in front of Paris, which will be useful. The Germans were able to get some of their beat up infantry divisions on their way back to the board, but that doesn't help their panzer situation, though they still have a pretty mean stack that will come back at the end of next turn. So we won't see the panzers really back until turn 7, but going into turn 6, I think the Germans will want to, they'll still want to make whatever ground that they can, right? Their goal will be to, if they can, punch a couple of holes open so that the Germans can attempt to infiltrate past these defensive markers. The other thing is, which I guess I didn't do, I should have, is these should really be on their reverse side, showing different tier markers. So there you go. So the important thing is, in scenario 1, these guys just provide a shift to the left. In scenario 3, they also increase the tactical rating for the units in that hex. And so it will be more difficult generally for the Axis, the Germans, to infiltrate lines, because now we're going to have a lot more tactical rating 4 units out there. We may even have units that are even higher, and that will be a greater challenge for the Germans to make use of. So it has a little +1 tactical rating marker on there. Yeah, so I think that's good. For those paying special attention, in an earlier segment of this video, I was wearing a gray hoodie, and I'm now wearing a green hoodie. That's how you know this isn't done in one day, guys. I just can't do it. All right, so that's it for turn 5. We are halfway through. This video is probably getting quite long, but it'll be long anyway. I'll come back and show the aftermath of turn 6, which will also show the new positions of the Panzer units after refit, and it will essentially be the start of Fall Rot Case Red. So I'll point out the locations of where the Panzers are at that point. Okay, here we are at the end of turn 6, and you can see not a lot has changed. So it is this very dramatic, situation of looking at the map and going, oh no, we're in World War I again. But truly, in the turn, both sides moved first, using all of their move actions before the combats came. And by the time either side could get into their present positions that you see on the map, the reality was that, really, the Germans couldn't attack anywhere, because of the multi-hex rule. We were trying to find places where we could go, but with every hex manned by a French unit with the improved defense marker, anywhere I would look to attack, the odds were just too bad. And even with airshifts, we tried and we got an AL1 over here. So it was like, what can I do to break this line? And looking at it, I mean, even with my infantry, big strong infantry corps, you can't stack them 2 in a hex. So you could top them off with some divisions and try to make something happen there. But the rivers, the defensive terrain, the improved defense markers were all pushing us down into the 1 to 2 column often. And I just can't concentrate enough firepower anywhere to make a breach. So this scares me for a couple reasons. One, without the armor, the Germans are going to get nowhere. They could try. They could try to make some attritional attacks, but they're really not favored on those attritional attacks. And if the Germans aren't careful, they're going to wear out their offensive capability to the point where they could only defend. So in a larger operational strategic situation, that could mean that the Germans denude their force trying to bash themselves against the French line, and eventually the French counterattack and stomp the Germans back into Germany or something. Who knows, right? So not looking good there. Now, fortunately, at the end of the turn, we did the Panzer refit, and so we now have our Panzer units back, and I've chosen to put them in places where I think we really need to try to make some breakthroughs. So over here, so they can try to get into this plain area towards Paris, which is further down. And several up here to try to get likewise into this plane right here that can get us further down. If we can't make a significant breakthrough over the next couple of turns, this is going to be an Allied victory. And it's just trying to look at it and figure out, like, okay, well, take those chance die rolls. Well, if you take that chance die roll and you only get maybe a what do they call it, a contact result, which may mean nothing happens, or possibly an engagement result where, because of these improved defense markers, the Germans will not, may not be ahead on tactical rating and may suffer a step loss where the French are fine. So I think it was, I mentioned it before in the video that I maybe could have done a better job at doing some smaller encirclements and just reducing the number of French units on the board. If I had done that, there would be fewer French units to man this line, and I would maybe not be able to infiltrate past them due to the improved defense markers, raising the tactical rating. But I could at least get some multi-hex attacks off with better odds, and start to create a breakthrough situation, even just doing that. But the fact that we are stuck in this current situation is tricky. Now, with the armor back, the armor is not as impacted by the multi-hex attack roll. So that kind of gives us some hope that we're going to be able to do something. But if we can't crack this line enough to just get stuff sailing off the map, well, we're going to be in some trouble. I think we're going to be in some trouble. I think generally we're already in some trouble because we need to get 10 or more supplied yellow MA units off the map edges by the end of turn 8. And if we're not super careful, we might not even have enough units in any position to get across the map that way. And we still need to take Paris, and we still need to, at this point, I'm doubting my ability to reduce the Allied units down low enough to meet that third criteria, to 15 or less units. I don't think I'm going to do that. So now it's about, can we get a breakthrough? Can we take Paris? If we can't do that, we're in trouble. If we can't get 10 yellow movement factor units off map by the end of turn 8, we're going to lose one of our 3 possible. We need 2 of 3. We'd lose that one, and then if we're not even able to do that, we're probably not able to completely eliminate enough units to get the other. So we could very quickly find the Germans will fail this campaign. And again, I think it just has come down to not killing enough guys back here via minor encirclements, or just trapping them and then removing them so that there's less down here. So you could say, successful strategic operational retreat on the Allied side and creating a hard defense along a well understood defensive, well chosen defensive line on the Somme. So I'm going to run through now turn 7, which is technically the Fallrot, case red turn. So there's the usual special rules governing that. In this scenario, the main thing is, let's see, the Germans are guaranteed to have all 4 action rounds. So they have the initiative. They get all 6 air assets, which is good. And the German and Allied players may now stack 3 motorized divisions per hex, but no more than 2 maybe armored type divisions. Okay, so it just means we can add motorized infantry to a panzer stack, which is nice. Okay. Well, there we go. So we'll be back after turn 7. Okay, here we are at the end of turn 7, which you can see that the Germans are still not quite getting to where they need to be. Now, we did force the French back off the Somme in a number of places. The power of the panzers all operating together with additional motorized infantry to help support some of those combats, just getting them enough of a column odds ratio, even with the variety of shifts to the left and shifts to the right and all that stuff. We did make some pretty strong pushes, but they were just that. They were largely pushes. So the Germans managed to get a move and a combat right in a row, which created uh, the initial sort of breakthroughs that were starting to happen. But then the French got 2 chits. They did a move and a combat. Now the first move was to try to get a new line formed, which you kind of see here. It wasn't all the way there. Um, in the first chit, and then for their second chit, they did not want to do another move because that would have just meant that it was their last move, and they wanted to have some response at the end. So they took a combat chit. The Allies did nothing with the combat chit, let it just sort of be almost like a pass. And then the Germans got a move. They tried to make some more headway. They moved some more units with some attacks. And then the last French chit came up, which is really too bad because I think they would have wanted to go last. But the French basically did a move to get more units into a good position. They couldn't move around a lot because they didn't want to lose the improved markers, which go away when you voluntarily move out of a space. But that was okay. And then in the final chit, which was a German combat, you had more French units being pushed back or hurt. But the key thing that you should notice here is that while the Germans have made some advancements of a couple of hexes and have sort of forced the French to pull back, the French have been able to pull back enough that they could reapply their improved defense markers, and we still have a consistent line held here. It's starting to get broken up over here, and over here you can see there's some gaps, but largely, this may be enough to just keep the Germans contained. That's all the French really need to do. They just need to contain them. Counterattacking doesn't even necessarily have to be what happens here, as long as they can contain the Germans. So that's kind of where things stand at the moment. Um, the Germans are feeling pressured because they just can't get to where they want to go and make the differences they would really like to make here to break open something. You can see, they're trying to, they got across these rivers. They're getting supply even here because there's a crossing right there. They've got sort of this path that they can try to be taking to get down to Paris, but that's not going to be enough in a vacuum. Same thing here, trying to push down through, trying to break something open, but we're just not getting these clean breakaways because inevitably the French get a chit, and if they can move, they will move to contain the breakthroughs, to coordinate their active defense, to pull back to more secure positions before the Germans can really get like a back-to-back move where they can get very, very far. It's just not working out that way. So definitely a huge change from scenario 1. So okay, we'll come back and we'll show the aftermath of turn 8. Something important I would just want to point out. This next turn, the Germans must get a certain number of units, I think it's like 10 yellow print movement factor units off map, west or south edge, to fulfill a victory condition. If they cannot do that, then it will mean that the only way that the Germans can win the scenario is to capture Paris and just eliminate as many Allied troops as they can, which feels unlikely at this point. So I would say going into turn 8, very low likelihood of a German victory, high likelihood of an Allied victory. So we'll see what happens in turn 8. Okay, here we are at the end of turn 8. Now, something important to throw out here is that we are now shut out of a victory condition for the Germans, one of the 3. So one of those is you get the 10 units off map, motorized units off map. But we didn't get that. there was some potential. We were starting to create some breakthroughs over here where it would have been feasible, but we would have needed another turn probably to have made that possible, and we didn't get it. We ran out of time, and that was even if I had waited to do well. I guess here's the thing. What I maybe could have done is delayed Panzer refit, gotten a couple more turns with them on map making progress, and then I would have had basically turn 8 when they returned to try to make something happen and get across the border. But it would have required us being much further along before that. So that's out. So now the only way that the Germans can win is by capturing all of Paris and reducing the number of supplied, that's the important part, supplied Allied units to 15 or less. So we don't have to eliminate units. I mean, we should, right? We should eliminate as many units as we can, but if we can create enough units that are out of supply, meaning some sort of localized set of encirclements that would knock stacks of units out of supply, that would actually be enough to trigger it. But we still have to capture Paris. So there's a very clear set of things that we must do. And in terms of we basically are going to have 2 turns to do it. We need to get through to Paris. Now, you can see we've got some German units awfully close. Sorry, I've got some things to adjust there that are awfully close. We're a few hexes away. If I can get out around, I might be able to take Paris from behind and encircle everybody in Paris and then grind them to dust over the course of a couple of combat rounds. All feasible, all potentially doable. But those improved defense markers, which the French, they had to abandon their positions last turn, but that meant they at least got to save these markers. They still have enough that there is something keeping this like a huge envelopment from occurring. So the French are really holding on. They are not counterattacking at all. They really are just trying to keep the Germans from getting in and getting to where they want to be. And so we've got a few guys out here on the flanks. The line exists, though it's a bit tattered. This guy's out of supply. I'm not sure we could leave him there out of supply, but if I can take him out this turn and get these core down, I'd probably want to do that. So yeah, so taking Paris is certainly feasible. In terms of the count right now for the counters, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the Maginot line right now. That can count supply for the moment. This guy can sorry. This guy counts supply through here, and then he can trace supply out. The Zocs don't matter for the Maginot line, so he can get, and there's no Zoc here, I guess, because of the major river. But anyway, point is this guy is in supply, though he looks around it at the moment. So 6 there, and then there's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 22, 23, 25, 27. So there's still a fair number of units that are going to have to be eliminated to reach that threshold. Now, I think it is feasible. It is doable. But what I wonder is, can the French just okay, let's say we're going to lose Paris. Maybe we say we lose Paris, but we retreat away. And if the Germans can't eliminate all of our units, then enough of a fighting force gets away that we keep the Germans from having the kind of victory that they want. I don't know what that means strategically, right? If you don't have a Dunkirk, but you have this prolonged offensive, Paris maybe still falls after tough fighting, but there is a remnant of a French army that can regroup, and maybe the will of the French government has not collapsed, and they keep fighting. And that's not the kind of war that Germany wants to be fighting at that point. I don't know how you want to look at that, but there you go. So we'll see what happens here in turn 9. I think this will be a very important turn generally speaking, and that will get us closer to the end game. Okay, here we are at the end of turn 9. So we have one turn to go. One turn to go, and oof, it's mighty dicey here, guys. So the Germans are now on the outskirts of Paris. Heavy fighting all around. We even got some German units that are really out of supply at this point because the French were able to get a move and kind of come in behind them. The Germans kind of creeping out this way, attempting to encircle Paris, and then I'd have to see if that counts for supply or not. But that's sort of a critical thing right now: is can they do anything about that? The other thing that I'm trying to figure out is, what do the French do, right? Because at this point they're just retreating. If I can get them into a safe place and they're in supply at the end of the turn, then they'll count. But it is possible that the Germans are just going to be able to, attack and surround enough of them that they won't be able to trace supply. And if the Germans can get into Paris, then they win. So the Allies are in this weird position where we could say, well, let's start to abandon Paris, and if we save all of our units, the Germans might be able to capture Paris, but if we've got enough units that are in supply, then the Germans will lose, even if they take Paris. Or if we don't think that's going to be enough, or if we think too many units are going to get surrounded or destroyed or whatever, then we might have to hold on to Paris and just hope for the best. But if Paris doesn't have a supply line, well, then we've got a problem. So those are some things that we're trying to figure out. Like, how do we do this? Now, doing a quick counter check again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the Maginot line. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. Because there were some reinforcements, actually. 28. So as long as we don't lose 13 guys in this next turn, then we're in good shape. And at this point, I probably should have been sending some of these Germans over here to try to catch those dudes out of supply. But I slept on that one. I probably had the ability to start moving guys over there, but it's kind of too late now. So a mistake on my part. Certainly, if the Germans lose this campaign, it's going to be because I made too many mistakes as them. Though I can't think of like, oh, this was a singular mistake. It's just a matter of I'm just not playing as competently as maybe I should be playing. So it is down to the wire here. I still think the Allies will probably save this one because they're not going to get totally put out of supply. But maybe that will change. We'll have to see if a proper noose can be wrapped around enough of these Allied units that they can't trace supply. It's got to be both. We've got to do both. I'm not sure the Germans are going to be able to because really they're going to have either 2 more moves and 2 more combats or 1 less than one of those if they don't roll high enough. So there's only 3 to 4 more German chits left to do those important things, and I just am not sure how they're going to be able to do that. These guys are back here because they were actually working on eliminating some French and British units that were surrounded. So it's all kind of kookiness now. It's all crazy. And technically, I forgot to move these guys, so I would say I would have moved these guys up somehow to some degree. Anyway, the important thing is we got 1 more turn to go, so let me go take care of that. Okay, guys, here we are at game end. If you look up the action sheet, you'll see for the first time in a long time the Allies had initiative, which pretty much spelled the doom of the German chance of winning. They tried to do as much as they could. Paris holds with 1 hex, though it is surrounded. A whole bunch of French units were eliminated, but we basically kept the Germans from achieving any of their victory conditions. The 6 units off to the east were in supply. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So there's still 17 in supply units, which is two more than needed. And then capture and hold 3 Paris hexes by the end of turn 10. Well, again, there's the one hex of Paris that, while surrounded, just didn't get taken. They couldn't seal the deal. And that has to do with the improved defense marker, the city hex, the fact that there's a 5 strength core there. They just didn't get it. So because of the Allies depriving the Germans of achieving all three, this is certainly an Allied victory. Now, an Allied victory under what terms? Who knows? The important thing is enough of the French army has survived, Paris has held out, and the Germans have attrited their losses that, Germany's probably not jumping to invade Yugoslavia, probably not jumping to help the Italians in North Africa, probably well delayed in any invasion of Moscow or the Soviet Union, and who knows about France itself, right? Are there enough forces still alive after the huge death toll over here that France can keep fighting? What is the historical narrative after this? Who knows? Hard to say. You'd figure France would keep, maybe keep fighting for a little while longer. The British, having not, I don't know, they lost a lot of guys. I don't know. It's like in the game terms, certainly an Allied victory. But there's something to be said about what does the historical situation of Case Yellow afford the Allies? Well, the British Army survives, and some French folks get off the continent, right? So there's a fighting force that survives. You save manpower, and you're situated such that yeah, sure, Vichy is declared, but at least the hostilities are over. And I don't know. It's kind of weird to think about, right? Like here, the British Army stayed on continent and did suffer a lot of attrition. But at this point, the Germans have also suffered a lot of attrition, though they still had a lot of guys on the Maginot Line I could have been doing more with, I guess. There's probably something to be said in terms of a post-mortem. I'll just include the post-mortem here in this video since it's already pretty long, but we might as well get everything all in one place. This whole game, whether you're playing scenario 1, 2, or 3, it always feels like this Maginot Line part is just this whole other little thing. And it's like, oh, maybe I should take this guy and slowly walk him over somewhere else. But it takes time, and the Germans don't seem to have rail movement in this game. So, like a strategic move to get those guys over takes a while, so you might as well leave them and hopefully get a breakthrough. But a breakthrough only does so much for you in the first place, and then really the whole game is like this side of the map. So that's kind of weird to think about. I don't think I figured out the proper way to leverage the forces that are on the Maginot Line at any given time, and knowing when to pull them off and when not to pull them off. It's kind of hard to say. I do think this scenario was pretty interesting. It definitely put my mind in a very different place. The Germans could not sort of kind of cruise or ride cruise control to being in a good game position, like maybe in scenario 1 you could kind of do that because you knew you're going to get to the Meuse, you could probably get across, you're going to make that sickle cut, there's going to be a mad scramble. The issue wasn't so much that you had to succeed tactically, it was could you you were clearly going to be operationally effective. The question was going to be, could you cut off enough units, could you situate yourself just right to capitalize on what was going on in scenario 1. We're here in scenario 3, like every combat kind of map, like everything you do is fighting to get that breakthrough, trying to find a good position to exploit, and is much more reminiscent of your Deadly Woods, your Dark Sands, your Dark Valley. Some of that just having to do with the fact, almost entirely maybe due to the fact that the Allies get to pick move or combat. Like that is such a huge difference that, in scenario one, you would have, oh, it's a combat chit. Well, the Allies can't do anything with that combat chit. So they just have to sit here. And then the next chit's German chit, and the Germans continue to wallop them. Here, it's like, oh no, movement is much better. Let's do that movement. Let's get situated. Okay, now we've got a combat. Yes, I do have a combat that I'd like to try to chip away at the Germans. So that is just a huge, huge thing. And I do appreciate that Ted, in the design of the series, he's been careful to adjust the chit pool availability to reflect that overall doctrine improvement. So clearly, in the scenario one of this, it is illustrating the Allies' lack of coordination and command and control capabilities, and it shows. In this scenario, it's positing that maybe if they had better command and control, would it made a difference? And clearly, I mean, it did make a huge difference. Maybe in the biggest zoomed out scheme of things, the French are still getting beaten back, but it was a much tougher fight, and the Germans lost a fair bit more of their capability along the way. So there's something to be said about that. If you compare this to something like the Dark Sands, like yeah, there's sort of an equivalent of capability there. The Deadly Woods, there's some equivalent capability, or the Dark Valley, where the Russians start with the USSR starts with very rigid action chits, and then over time they get better ones. And it's an interesting way to handle it, though dramatically impactful if you're playing the faction that can only do a move or can only do a combat in a given situation. You just have more limited options. So I definitely think that this scenario was worth playing. Like it was very different feeling. I mean, you could take some of the same strategies that you had from other scenarios and apply it here, but the challenge was different. How you see the map is very different. The fact that now rivers matter even more, because before the Germans could kind of expect to maybe get across those rivers and cause problems for the Allies, where every river is advantageous to the Allies here. If they can just move a little bit and get across that river at the right time, they can save themselves from huge, huge losses. And I think that was really significant. Um, so it's kind of interesting to see that play out. So overall, I think from scenario one, where we kind of had some very particular circumstances lead to overwhelming German victory after I restarted, here we see a much tougher fight, but an Allied victory just on the conditions. A hampered German army coming out of this campaign, a much rougher fight than maybe they were hoping. It does make me think about, like, did when the Germans are invading France in 1940, how do you know you're going to fight an army that has chits that are move only or combat only, right? Like obviously they're not thinking in those terms historically, but it's like, gosh, if the Germans were acted very boldly in their campaigns, right? In World War II, everything was about quick unexpected maneuvers and tight execution and all these different things. But it's like that worked best when the enemy had bad command structures, right? And maybe the Germans figured as much, right? But a big thing about Case Yellow games and like Blitzkrieg Legend, that is OCS, kind of covers a similar idea. Like, well, there's certain things that made this campaign the way that it was. Yes, there were some things that the Allies did that just made it harder, but it didn't have to be that way. But if you're a German, you know, field marshal, like, are you looking at it and saying, yes, we believe the French are going to operate, ineffectively, and that will give us the edge? If that really was it, and I'd have to read in the history to understand what the thinking was, then yeah, you get the sickle cut, you do all these things. That's what historically happened. But if you didn't know that for sure was going to happen, right? I mean, the Germans very well could have found themselves in this situation where, while it is a victory, it is a bit of a Pyrrhic one if you've, lost, entire panzer divisions. Sure, when you remove a chit or a counter from the map, it doesn't mean everyone, in that counter represents died. But if you're totally knocking entire panzer divisions out of commission for many, many months, like that has a long-term effect on World War II, probably to some degree. And is that the kind of war that the Germans would have wanted to have, right? It's just a very interesting topic, right? The Germans do get to defeat France in our history, right? That is what happened, and because of that, they were able to do a lot of other things, and they were better prepared to keep following on those things until mid, or well, 41, 42, when they got stuck in Soviet Union. But the fact that they accomplished these goals in France as early as they did allowed them to do a lot more broadly in Europe, more support to North Africa, more effort able to be expended helping the Italians in Greece, and all these other things that, like in this game situation, if the Allies had just performed better, even if they were losing, might have denuded the German strength to really change the outcome of the war. So this was an interesting one for sure. This scenario, I'm glad that it's included in the game. It's definitely an interesting change up in a fun way to say, okay, hey, scenario one is what it is. You want to play something, you and your buddy are going to play this game. You want to play something different. This gives you something cool. So with that said, I think this video can come to a close now. So if you've watched the video, thank you very much. I know it's a little bit different than the usual style. It's more abbreviated, and I think that can work and be very helpful for folks who don't want to sit through 12 hours of content or more, as the case may be. The next video on my list to do here is then a full review of Case Yellow 1940 in my usual style. So all of this video content is not meant to be a review. We will do the standard review model that you may have seen in other videos of mine for this game, which will mean we will have a solid review for every game in the Dark and Deadly series, including Case Yellow, because I like to include it in that set. And that opens the door to ranking the games and some other stuff. So that seems pretty cool. We'll look to do some of that stuff. So again, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Take care. Keep on gaming.